Our first afternoon session features 4 panelists who will address effective techniques to limit insect infestation in grain storage. The session will be moderated by Perry Nettles, South Regional Manager for Ecolab based in Jonesboro, Arkansas. The panelists include Blake Buckner, Director of Operations for Degesh America out of Wares Cove, Virginia, Justin Moses, District Manager for Ecolab based in Saline, Kansas, Peter Miller, President and owner of Fumigation Service and Supplies in Westfield, Indiana, and Todd Willem, Key Account Manager for UPL in Indianapolis, Indiana. Please welcome our panelists.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Apologies up front if my voice starts crackling or breaking up a little bit. Some of us are still recovering from Chris Stapleton last night. But it was a great time. It was a pleasant surprise. We didn't know that was going to be going on, but we made it a look at doing that in the future for other Convey conventions. So some questions were submitted. I feel like I got a feedback. Some questions were submitted before today's panel, before this week's show. So I'm going to get into some of the questions that were submitted, and then we'll just get into open panel discussions from the audience. Any issues or concerns you've seen in the field, or any trouble that you're running into with insects or problems with pests at your facilities. So let's just jump right in. So one of the first questions we got, how does grain condition and conditioning affect your treatment approach? Go ahead, Pete.
This thing on?
Right. Killing it.
Yeah, well, grain conditioning, I think, has everything to do with pest management, with a successful fumigation. I mean, insects are a symptom of a condition, and just by us taking grain, drying it to the right temperature, right moisture, and putting it in an upright storage is perfect for insect population growth and harborage. We have different insects that we target. I mean, we're all familiar with the weevil and the brand bugs, but based on whole kernel, fractured kernel, FM, or moisture, we create microenvironments that are more conducive for one type of pest or another. So to step back a little bit on what a fumigation is it's a pesticide that reaches a target organism as a gas, not as a liquid. So we need the insect to respire, to breathe, to be effective and have effective control. So we need to take that grain condition and conditioning and build the fumigation approach off of it, from that, to contend with those things. So we've got to penetrate masses of fines and FM, get the gas to where the insect is to have control. Fumigant won't penetrate moisture, we've got to break up the hot spots. We've got to eliminate that condition to be successful.
Cool. So you were just mentioning about respiration. So what about insects respiration in the cooler months? I know you manage a lot in Michigan, Ohio, upper U.S. states. So what about the cooler months? How do you overcome the cold temperatures when you need to perform a treatment?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's something that we get to contend with. Every fumigation event is a different one, whether it's a bin that you're fumigating 3 or 4 or 5 times a year because of product rotation, or if it's something the first time, but we need to approach it as if it's the first time every time. So some of the things temperature-wise that we deal with, or as the environments change, is having 4 seasons in the corn part of the world. You might show up to a facility that is in the heat of harvest, where we're a guest at that facility. We're kind of an invasive part of the operation. Fumigant doesn't work. Phosphine down to 40 degrees. If it's 40 or below, don't fumigate. But we're going to have a conversation between myself and you if we're below 55. So we need the insects. We need the insects to breathe, not only the active ones that we're seeing walking around because it's warm, but the embryonic stages, the eggs and the larvae that aren't as susceptible to to respiration because of the temperature.
Gotcha. Cool. So as you're talking about these lower temperatures, not respiring enough, maybe not getting enough active fumigant right on the nose of the insect, I'm hearing a lot in our market. We always field the questions, what about phosphine resistance? Is that a thing? What are we seeing with it? What's happening? Are insects really becoming resistant to phosphine? Blake Wodegish.
Thank you. That's like you said, it's a question that we get no matter where we go, and it always comes up. And really, I think it's important to first define what is resistance. Truly, what is resistance? And to the converse, what is not resistance? So I guess it starts with resistance as a whole is you use for this example, you use phosphine, and you fumigate at a certain level, and the insects don't die. That's the way that everybody views it. When in truly what it is, and everybody thinks, it's sort of been hotly contested over the course of the last decade, and with all the data that's coming out, it's much less hotly contested because truly what's happening is resistance is a naturally occurring genetic mutation. It is not caused by phosphine in and of itself. What's actually happening is you're fumigating and you're killing either the non-resistant or the weak resistant insects. And the insects that are surviving are either strong resistant, mid resistant, and that's another thing to note. It's not resistant or not resistant. It's a wide scale. And I'm not a geneticist, and I'm not a board certified entomologist, but I do have thousands of fumigations under my belt using phosphine and eliminating these pests. So I do want to get that out there. But what ends up happening is these pests then propagate, and over time, you develop a larger and larger population of resistant insects, almost sometimes to the point to where they're all resistant. So is resistance getting worse? Yes and no, depending on your fumigation practices. It's not getting worse. They're just surviving more at the level that you're fumigating at.
So what can we do as fumigators, and what can the people in the audience do that does their own fumigating in-house to help combat the resistance issues?
So it really kind of goes back to my first point, is that the first thing you need to do is figure out whether you actually have resistance. And there's really only one way to do that, and you have to use good fumigation practices. Sealing the building very well, or the grain silo, or whatever your fumigation target is, you have to seal that very well. And you have to follow the dosages, the advisory dosages. And when I say that, you need to pay very close attention to that, because the old mantra of following the dosage, it's not, hey, every year at this time we throw 5 flasks of phosphine into this silo. What that means is you have to measure the temperature inside of the silo at the time of fumigation, and then determine your dosage, and then determine your duration. It's not using minimum concentration, minimum time, minimum dosage at all points. So once you've done that and established your dosage, your time, and your temperature, and you fumigate, if you still have resistant pests, you open it up, if you still have pests alive after the fumigation, naturally you're going to think, well, they're resistant. Well, how do you know? If you fumigate at a certain dosage, that means that you're trying to hit a target parts per million, a ppm. So the most critical part to even identifying resistance is monitoring. Number one, monitoring for pests after the fumigation, but more importantly, monitoring the concentration of the fumigant inside of the fumigated target during the concentration. So if you're trying to fumigate at 300 parts per million for 5 days, and you monitor that, and you fumigate at 300 parts per million for 5 days, and then you have live insects, you may very well have resistance. And at that point, you would want to test for it. There are test kits that are out there. You can test for it. You can send it off to an extension. You can send it off to K-State, wherever. I know it's a bad word to say here, but at that point, then you can say you have resistance. Now, I do want to say one more thing. Hopefully, I'm not running over, but there's a bunch of different ways you can mitigate it out there, and one of them from other sides of the aisle have been, well, you got to stop using phosphine. That's not necessarily true. The label was written very broadly for a reason. So there's a lot of wiggle room in both dosage, amount, and time. There's no wiggle room in temperature. But if you can increase your dosage and increase your time, then you can very well probably take care of them. And I have a lot of background information in that. Mine is mostly with the cigarette beetle, which is extremely difficult to kill, 300 parts per million for 12 days, and it still works. Now, I know not everybody has 12 days, but what I'm saying is you can increase your dosage and your time. And then, if that doesn't work, you can switch it up to another fumigant. But you only need to do that once if it's not affordable for you. If you switch it up to one fumigant once, you break that cycle, and you can go back to phosphine.
Excellent. Just to reiterate with that, the monitoring piece, I can't stress that enough. You know, we see that the same bin, we do it every year, we know how many pellets to put in it, but maybe somebody left a dust collector on, maybe didn't shut off the dust collector slide gate, maybe there was a crack in the concrete under the subfloor, now it's leaking into another bin. So we see that a lot. They just assume, well, Uncle Larry's done it this way for 20 years, it should be fine, we're gonna keep doing it that way.
I use your Uncle Larry all the time when you're not around, but just to add to that, just to be very, very clear, what I'm talking about when I say monitoring is high-range efficacy readings. I mean, obviously need to be taking low-range safety readings, industrial hygiene. What I'm talking about is high-range efficacy readings throughout the fumigation to ensure that you've maintained that concentration. Without that, you don't know whether you have resistance or not. You're guessing.
Great. Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, sorry to jump in, but to support what you got. We live in an awesome time with technology. Most of us, all of us, have a cell phone in our pocket right now. And if that's the case, you have the ability to take readings on a fumigation that you have going on. You have the investment on the front side to buy the monitor. We've got some of them that are out right now. There's really no reason why we shouldn't be monitoring, especially when it's as critical to preserve the chemistry that we have.
I misrepresented the truth. I am gonna say one more thing. Actually, we're expecting in the new label that's coming out, our new label that's coming out, we're expecting resistance language therein that's going to mandate that you do seal well, use good practices, and monitor throughout the fumigation. It's already in there, by the way, that you need to monitor throughout the fumigation, but we're doubling and tripling down on that. There's expected to be some resistance language in the new label.
Got it. And the tagline for us that are seasoned veteran fumigators that do this for a living is, we get a call, we still got insects after the fumigation, did you monitor? No. Well, we don't have a monitor. Well, we've always done it, we always got a good kill. Well, our tagline in the industry is that's fumigating, not fumigating, right? It's a hope and a prayer, we think it's gonna work, and if you don't monitor it, all that money you spend on that fumigant, the sealing, the time, the labor on the front end, is all for naught. Now you gotta redo the whole process and look at how much more that's costing you versus buying a monitor that's a couple of $1,000s, right? One failed fumigation could pay for a handheld monitor. Maybe not the cool remote ones like Pete has, but we're all getting there, right? The remote monitoring is the wave of the future. And being able to watch a bin fumigation on your phone, giving you that level of comfort, it's just a game changer in our industry. Todd?
I just want to mention a study that USDA did on resistance, and what they found was it's not a need for increase of ppm or concentration. It was more based on a concentration of extension of time. So what Spencer Walsh found was at 72 hours, 1,000 parts per million, he was able to kill 99.9% of the most resistant strand ever found in the globe.
Wow,
So-
I haven't seen that study yet. Interesting. Okay, so if we're fumigating, right, we just got a bin, it's got a bunch of insects in it, we just throw pellets or cylinderized gas or whatever at it, right? I mean, does it matter what insect we're trying to kill? I mean, everything's just a brand bug, right? Does the insect matter? Justin? Nope.
So, there we go. Insects, I mean, yeah, determining the type of insect, that's where we should start. Because you have, some of your top three are gonna be your internal feeders, your secondary feeders, and your mold and fungus feeders. And kind of what Pete said is that with a fumigant, it's not gonna penetrate any moisture areas. So if you have your mold and fungus feeder, and that's what you're actually wanting to get rid of, you don't have any other insects in there, you're not gonna get rid of them that easily with our fumigants. It's not gonna penetrate that area. But secondary feeders, we can get rid of those a little easier with it. It'll penetrate those areas a little better, but it's also, so what that can tell you is the condition tells a story what's inside that grain bin, because we can't just look inside there. So you can tell if there is a crusting or a molding or any kind of issue like that. Maybe it's something we just need to turn it onto itself and cool it down a little bit, or some kind of treatment on it of some sort of that nature instead of a fumigant. It might be the best bet. But that's really kind of where it really starts with.
So you're a fumigator selling against fumigating. I love that
Yeah,
strategy.
yeah, sorry.
That's a good way to go out of business. I completely get where you're going, but yeah, conditioning the grain if it's more of the mold-feeding insects. Start with the insect first. I like it. So everybody in the room that's not an associate certified entomologist or has taxonomy classes, like how do you know what the insect is? How does the normal layman know when they're an eighth of an inch big?
A ruler?
Okay.
No, you can send it to us at Ecolab. We have entomologists on staff that we can always send it to and get IDs on it and get back to whole case studies of what type of insect, the best way to combat them. There's other, I'm sure everybody's got entomologists on their staffs of some sort that can get back to you and identify those insects so you know what you're actually going up against, because it can help you out figuring out what type of fumigant to use and best practices.
Yep, great call. Yeah, and a lot of your local county extensions agencies can do the same thing with your state pest plant boards or whatever, but you should be able to turn to whoever your fumigation provider is or whoever you're buying your fumigant from first off, and if they can't help provide you a good answer, maybe look at a different fumigant provider. We should all be able to identify and have that taxonomy knowledge to at least be able to identify the filthy 15 primary insects that we're trying to target. Yeah, Pete?
Yeah, I would, stick my neck out right now and say that you're probably doing a disservice to your facility if your graders don't know what the insects that you're seeing, dead or alive. There's 15 insects, species and subspecies that target stored grain in our area. We're not getting a lot of weird invasive stuff. That's when we've got extension agencies and so forth. But that $15 an hour seasonal helper that's probing trucks as they're coming through, for them to be able to identify that we have some on-farm storage that's getting blended and coming in with weevil might be the difference between rejecting it, isolating it, or having to fumigate the entire facility. Like you were saying with brand bugs, it's once you pull that plug through the plant, it's everywhere.
Agreed. Love it. All right, so we decided we found some insects. We identified them as stored product pests. We're going to do some sort of treatment. The moisture is right. It's been conditioned. It's in a good storage. It's sealed up tight. So we got to get to the facility to kill the insects first. So kind of give some of this team some direction on what's needed to transport the fumigant to actually get it from wherever it was received at, if it was shipped or if you have it at a warehouse location. How do you get it to that facility site to actually do the fumigation?
I'll answer one.
Go ahead, Todd.
So all fumigants do require a CDL with the hazmat endorsement. You can haul it in a pickup truck, but it has to be secured. It has to be in its original container. So whether that's the cylinder or the case, or I know, you can buy the individual flask in a smaller inner box that has a full label on it. As long as it has the label on the outside of the packaging, you're good to go. There is an exemption for phosphine. It's for one case, 21 kilograms.
So what do you mean exemption?
So there's an exemption for phosphine, aluminum and magnesium phosphide. So one case of aluminum phosphide or one pail of magnesium phosphide. And what that special exemption gives you, you still have to have a CDL, you still have to have the hazmat, you just don't have to placard the outside of the vehicle. So there's a lot of confusion on that. In the past, I know a lot of people thought you could just throw a case in, I've got the exemption, I'm good. But the only thing the exemption says is you don't have to placard.
Thank you. Yeah, there's been a lot of, I feel questions about that all the time, I can carry a case. I don't have to do anything. I don't need the CDL. I'm good. But you still have to have the hazmat CDL. And the new DOT training is pretty intense to even get certified to do the DOT test, to even get the CDL. But you still have to have the hazmat CDL to even haul one case of fumigant or anything.
Correct.
You just don't have to placard. Okay. So to go along with that, you were saying the original case, right? So if you order a case of 14 flasks, right? You can't take 3 flasks out, throw them in a service vehicle, and go fumigate a bin, right? They still have to be carried in that original case.
So there is
And secured.
DOT we call them DOT tablets.
Yep.
It's 14 individual boxes inside of a big box.
Right.
Now, if you just have a case of loose flask,
Yep.
then you have to take the entire case.
Thank you. Yep. All right, we've got a couple more questions, but we're going to kind of open it up to the audience. Is there anybody that's had any questions or any issues with doing some fumigations at your facilities, or issues with any of the fumigators on the stage? Nobody. Everybody's a perfect fumigator. There we go. I knew we'd get a taker.
What can you give us for tips on doing fumigation for trains or trucks?
All right. Have somebody with a strong back if you're flipping hatches on or multiple people on a hoop track. Yeah, so there is an exemption for transportation over the rail because it's not public road. We can't do trucks, hopper bottom trucks or trailers going over the highway or even down a county road. The caveat to that is the rail line, there's a handshake that in transit we can fumigate rail cars. So the rail car has to have a placard that withstands all weather conditions for the duration of the treatment. There's special, just like every fumigation, every fumigation is a new and unique situation. There's inspections that need to be done on the cars. I've seen some that can barely keep grain in it, let alone fumigate. And some extra sealing that needs to go into it. So, we like to do it under fall protection. I know there's an odd proximity law that's acknowledged out there for us, exemption to use. Have 2 people on site. There's a lot of things that are moving when you're doing it. So placards on both sides of the top. If you're doing pneumatic for like flour, everywhere where the fumigant's stored inside, and then on either side where the ladder is at a minimum, both sides. So if there was a derailment, there was a lot of them this past year. If there was a car, heaven forbid, that was on it, they'd be able to identify what was going on. Truck trailers, if it's corn, there's the whole, it'll penetrate 20 feet, but that's if it has resistance and a good seal. If you're just sprinkling pellets in for a rejected load and closing the tarp on it, we can't really expect to, we're running into what Blake's running into. We're not having the exposure time, the temperature, and the concentration to be successful. Does that kind of help?
So you can fumigate a trailer, just not while it's in transit. So you could park it, lock it out, the airlines or whatever, and fumigate it
For sure.
while it's sitting in a lot or something.
Put a glad hand lock on it, do it on the edge of the property where it can be safely monitored for bystanders. Absolutely. Yes, thank you, Perry. I'd hate for everybody to say, Pete said you can.
Pete said you could fumigate trailers. Yeah.
I'll just add real quick to that one thing in the label that is extremely important is you have to make sure that you notify the receiver on the other end.
Yep. Great call.
I think it says in writing in the manual, but we like to do it both ways, in writing via the paperwork that's on board the vessel, whether it's a boxcar or whatever. But we also like to send it via email just to cover the tracks.
There are some states that are different, and somebody has to be trained and equipped with a calibrated monitoring device. And some states require for a certified applicator to be present to vent it and clear it. So if you send it off to a state that requires an applicant and an applicator, and it holds up the whole system, you could be in.
If you're fumigating it in-house, then make sure you're documenting exactly how many pellets went on board, when they fumigated, how much they fumigated. And then if you're having it subcontracted, obviously make sure that your third party is providing you with that information just for any claims on the other end.
Yeah, and if you're shipping any type of processed product, flour cars, I'm from Arkansas. We mill and ship and fumigate a lot of rice in Arkansas. Thanks to the Bud Light controversy, there's a lot of rice sitting around in Arkansas right now. So sales are down about 30%. So there's 30% more rice sitting around in Arkansas because Anheuser-Busch is the largest purchaser of rice in the United States. But anytime you're doing a finished commodity like that and you're using the prepackaged products, it is paramount that you really are detailed about how many packs you put in each hopper, that's on the paperwork. Because when he gets that end consumer and there's, oh, I wrote my number down wrong, or there's a pack missing and now they're rejecting an entire rail car, legal gets real happy real quick throwing around some big numbers. So be very judicious on exactly how many pre-packs you put in each hopper of each car.
And make sure they know how to deactivate them.
Yeah. Some of the rail cars we found on the ends, they have vents. It's kind of, you got to lean over the edge and look up. There's a little cup that covers it. Some of the rail cars have little vents on each end, so make sure that your teams are trained on how to watch for those vents on some of these hopper bottom rail cars.
One of the things too with rail cars is they have the rubber gasket around the lids. Make sure that's intact, because these rail cars are going down the rail sometimes 60 miles an hour. I mean, it's going to push that gas right out, and you're not going to have the right concentration where you want it at the end of the line where that ends up being.
So you were talking earlier about transporting fumigants and what all goes into that, but what about storage of fumigants? I know we as a bulk wholesaler supplier, I mean, we're regulated by Homeland Security now, EPA Tier 2 serial report, like the list goes on and ad nauseum of the stuff we have to do as a bulk wholesaler, but what about just storage and keeping the fumigant on site at a facility?
Yeah, I mean, that's very important. So, you know, you hear the horror stories every year of products ending up in the wrong hands. So, you know, keep it in of course, a dry, locked facility, but it has to be a detached facility. So if it has to be totally detached, not like storing other pesticides where they can just be stored in the garage. You know, this is a gas, so if it gets loose, it's going to penetrate through walls. So a totally detached building, and then, you know, I always tell people, don't take this stuff home. You know, if you're done at the end of the day and you've got a couple flasks left, take the extra time, take it back to your storage facility, and put it in a locked box.
Perry? Got a
Chuck, go
question
ahead, Chuck.
on containers.
Yeah.
If that I'm shipping to Asia.
Yep.
If I fumigate them in the rail yard in Detroit, can they be loaded on the rail and transported? And if so, what happens when they get to California and have to be unloaded at the rail yard and transported to the port?
Well, I'll let somebody else handle that one. So we fumigate a lot of containers, and we do ship them to different ports around the country, and we fumigate it at the ports, but I haven't heard the question of a fumigated container getting to a port. And I guess it would just be on that property, right?
Well,
Not really
if,
going down the highway?
if I can fumigate hopper bottoms, can I fumigate a container right at the rail yard?
Yes.
And have it transported?
Yes, if it's on the rail, but once it gets to where it's going, how do you get it from the rail to its next destination without being aerated?
Unless the container goes the port is the rail yard.
Agreed.
A lot of times they're offloaded at a separate facility and then transported by truck to the port.
That is a great question.
No,
Blake or Todd?
I mean, the label is, you know, it can go across rail. It cannot go across public road. So in order to transport it across public road, you would have to air it down below 0.3 parts per million.
Yeah, so I guess if it's on the property at the port and just transferred from the rail over to the vessel or wherever it's going, you're okay there. But if it actually has to go down a public highway or a road, then it would, per the label's a law, we all know label's federal law, it would have to be aerated to below 0.3 ppm, in my opinion.
What state or agency is issuing the FIDO? Do you need one? Gotcha. So I'd look into if the treatment is required to get the certification there in Michigan for the process to be completed with your seal on it to make the cut, the rail cut, or the ship. Because now you start getting into logistics with a handshake of having it cleared at the port to merge on the.
Fumigated at our facility and then shipped on trucks to the rail yard, but if I can go to the rail yard in Detroit, can I fumigate it there?
Sorry. It'll need to be cleared before it makes it onto the ship. So there's going to be a logistics handshake that has to be happen. And then I would really, really be leery about your certifying body to make sure that, you know, the state of Michigan would recognize the treatment, but then the completion of it and removal of spent material when it makes it in California.
And then is there an issue of that container still being sealed and landing in a foreign port?
You're looking at about $40,000. So either one, to have it cleared at the mercy of whatever country gets it, any penalties that you have. And, if it messes with the FIDO, if it doesn't have a FIDO cert, they'll either have to, they'll have to incinerate it or destroy it, or they'll probably still use it, but they'll just bill you for it.
And one thing I'll add, I picked up on a little bit of the language there, and all right. Something that would concern me, and don't ask me how I know this, and it's not explicitly in the label like it says public roads. I would be extremely cautious because the way it sounded to me was they're being fumigated and then loaded onto a train. I'd be extremely cautious about that and have a fumigator on standby when they're being loaded, because you just never know what's going to happen. So if at all possible, I would prefer to see them loaded than fumigated.
But I think, Pete, what you're getting at is to fumigate it in Michigan at the port or wherever, fumigate it, hold it 96 hours, whatever that standard treatment is for DDGs or whatever it is, and then clear it, aerate it, and then get it on the train, right? I mean, that'd probably be the best case scenario if at all possible.
Correct. I mean, you'd have 100% control of the process then.
Yeah. I know you get into demerge, but then you can put your seal on it after it's cleared. Any other questions around containers or DDGs or export containers? Anything at the ports? I know we're kind of in the middle of America, nowhere near a port right now. All right. Blake, you were talking earlier about monitoring. So we called it fumigating versus fumigessing, right? If you're not monitoring, but is that all you do is just, all right, yeah, it's 1,000 ppm and you're good? Is there anything else in monitoring that we should be aware of per the label?
Yeah, I sort of spoke about it earlier, and this is more of a safety issue as far as low range monitoring. Really, you should be taking low range monitoring readings in any area that has a remote chance of accumulating more than 0.3 parts per million. And I'm not talking about in the fumigated structure. I'm talking about outside the fumigated structure and on the perimeters of that. And it sort of speaks to a bigger point, and I'm sorry if you were here last year and remember anything that I said, but it really comes back to the education and communication. We are trying to protect fumigators as fumigators, but when it comes to low range and industrial hygiene monitoring, we're really trying to protect bystanders and the general public who has no idea what's going on. So it's important to educate them and communicate with them that there's a fumigation going on, and then on the back end, taking low-range monitoring readings to make sure that no fugitive emissions have gone outside the fumigation area.
So does the label state that you must take low-range gas
Absolutely.
readings? So
Absolutely.
label's a law, right? So a lot of these talks we do around the country, we talk about Uncle Larry. Honest to God, he's my Uncle Larry. He's been my uncle 3 times. He's married my aunt 3 different times. He's no longer my uncle, but he is a fumigator. But he's been doing it 20 years, and he knows everything, right? He goes to the recertification class every year. He sleeps through it. He goes for lunch, and then he gets his license renewed. But he knows how to do it, right? You can't tell me I've been doing it 20 years. I don't need to monitor. If I smell it, I know to run. If you're smelling it, number one, you're already in big trouble. Number two, phosphine gas, it affects the olfactory senses, so you kind of go numb to it pretty quick. So you're in extremely high levels, and you don't even know it. So this is not a gas detection device. The label states you must monitor low-range readings, and if you're not, you're violating federal law. And you're completely liable if anything happens to your employees, if you haven't trained them properly, if you don't have calibrated monitoring devices on site, and if you can't prove to an insurance body or to the state regulator who's coming in to investigate an accident and have all that equipment and documented and on site, you're 100% liable because you violated federal law. The label is a law. So more and more companies, and it's not a sales pitch, but more and more companies, when you get into these regulations, and if something happens at your facility, have you ever read the Dagish Weevil side, whatever, the fumigation manual, it's not the one page that's on the flask. That's not the label. It's the 38-page applicator manual. You have to follow every paragraph, every sentence, all 48 pages to the T, or you're liable. You're violating federal law. When's the last time you read that entire 38-page fumigation manual? It's been a while for me, probably a few weeks. But for a lot of you, you probably never read the whole thing. Uncle Larry's told you how to use it. He's always had the license, and he just does it. So you trusting your company's reputation to the Uncle Larry that says he knows how to do it because he's had a license for 30 years? Or you reading that manual with a fine-tooth comb, documenting all of your training, having all your paperwork, having your fumigation management plan, I'll ask somebody that next, and having your FMP updated and on file and ready for an auditor as soon as something happens, okay? So what is a fumigation management plan? How often do we do one? Somebody that how about
Every
somebody that makes
treatment.
the fumigant?
Every treatment.
Every treatment.
It's required every treatment to have a new fumigation management plan. Now, the good thing about fumigation management plans is once you fill one out, if you ever have to retreat the same structure, it's basically 90% finished. You just have to go back, modify it a little bit, but it is, I mean, it's a lengthy document at the beginning, but once it's done, you know, it's mostly done for the next time.
So is that for all fumigants or just pellets?
That's all fumigants. Every fumigation,
Got it. All right. Everybody in here has filled out fumigation management plans for your facilities. You're all aware of what all goes into them. Jess?
Question. So I know EPA is in the process of recertifying phosphine. Do you anticipate any changes to the phosphine management plan during that recertification?
To the fumigation management plan itself, I don't know that there's going to be a ton of material changes to that. I know that we're expecting, most of the language that we're expecting is going to be the resistance that I spoke about, the resistance language, quite a bit about buffer zones. I know it's a really dirty word to say sometimes, but we have some promising news on that. But yeah, I don't know the complete answer to that question from what I know, but I don't think there's going to be a fundamental change to the fumigation management plan. I could be wrong.
So, can you expound on buffer zones? Like, what does that mean? Is that the buffer of how big an area around a treatment area it'll kill other insects, or what's a
No,
buffer
so
zone?
I might need a little help here from Todd, but now buffer zones, there was a lot of talk about putting in buffer zones outside of the fumigated area, a minimum amount of space between the fumigated area and bystanders. Like I said, we're still through the registration, we're still going through the re-registration process, but what we're expecting is that there aren't going to be any treatment buffer zones. So during the fumigation, there's not going to be expected to be any buffer zones. I don't know that that really matters because I don't know that how you're going to like somehow magically create an amount of space. But what's crucial to that is the buffer zones that will be put in place. And I'm not going to bore you with all the tables. There's literally like 25 or 30 different tables, whether you're aerating from the ground level, mid-level, from the roof, natural aeration. But the genesis of it is if you're going to be aerating from the roof line, natural aeration, and it's less than, I think it's like 2.3 million cubic feet, then no buffer zones are required. There's a bunch of different tables. I'm not gonna go through them. But do you have anything to add to that, Todd? We spoke about it before, but.
I think you did a good job. I think so. There was comment periods back and forth between the Phosphine Producers Association and EPA, and I think they have done a good job of pushing the buffer zones out far enough that it's really not going to affect the majority of fumigations. Like he said, if you're doing a huge facility, you may run into something. There is another comment period coming up. If it's not out yet, it's going to be coming out very shortly for phosphine. I would encourage anyone that uses phosphine to log on to EPA and make some comments. Every little bit helps. Right now it's the PPA against EPA, and if we can get some industry people to give their input, your voice will be heard and it'll help a lot.
I would just add to that NGFA is very supportive of
Thank you.
of PPA and the work that y'all are doing with that, and we're happy to assist in any way we can. And just wanted to just state that I know it's a very important issue. with the fumigation management plan and the buffer zones that are currently, and obviously there's a lot of concern with the current administration on what that could mean, so that's very good news to hear. And obviously, I think we're very supportive of the current fumigation management plan in place, and definitely would keep it as much as we can in its current state.
Thank you. Yeah, I did want to add one thing to the buffer zones because I don't know that I clearly explained it. It's a grid, so it's going to be the size of your structure, and then on the x-axis is going to be the terminal concentration. So that's what the concentration, again, you need to monitor for that. But at the end of your fumigation, what your terminal concentration is and the size of your facility will intersect, and that's what will determine what your buffer zone is or is not. And I wasn't trying to make light of it and say that, hey, they're not going to be a big deal, but most of the terminal concentrations are so high, they're in like the 800-900 range, that's why most fumigations, a lot of fumigations, are not going to be subject to buffer zones. We're expecting.
And kind of tag along with that, and we mentioned earlier about keeping track of fumigants, and you hear the horror stories that somebody found the magic pills and they know it kills everything, so they take them home and they sprinkle them under their trailer to get rid of cockroaches, and now they wake up the next day and the family's passed away. Like, we hear all these stories all the time, and every time that happens, that gets reported to EPA. Every time that there's an employee fatality or somebody gets sick from a fumigant or a fumigant exposure or misapplication, all of that gets reported. So we have to be great stewards of the products that we're using, either us as the professional applicators or you as the trained applicators and the Uncle Larry's, because every time that gets reported to EPA, when these fumigants come up for re-registration, they review all of those cases and all of the safety incidents and all of the fires that happened. And then now they're just building a case against us. We literally have 3 tools in our toolbox, not counting all of the sprays and the grain protectants and all the other cool stuff out there. But we have methyl bromide, which is only for quarantine, like port stuff, logs, weird stuff. We have phosphine and SF. We have 2 fumigants in the United States to control all of our stored product pests. If we lose either one of those 2 tools, we are in big, big trouble. We talk about resistance. Now we're making it worse. I don't know about all the resistance claims and everything, but if we don't protect these 2 tools that we have left and be really good stewards of them, we're all going to be in a world of hurt when we don't have any options left but CO2 or ethylene dioxide or whatever else may be coming down the pipeline, some future state stuff. But right now, the phosphine is a phenomenal product. Profume's a great product. And that's the only 2 tools we have left in our toolbox right now. So please, if you're doing them in-house, be very judicious about what you're doing. Study that manual, study all 38 pages, and make sure you're following that to the T. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about fumigation management plan, and early on in the re-registration process, EPA was talking about buffer zones at the time of treatment or your target concentration, and they were talking 1,000 feet. And it was, but what the PPA was able to do is say, look, we already have a fumigation management plan that mitigates most of the risk, so let's use that. And we were able to push back on EPA, and that's why we got to the position where now they're looking at concentration at the time of aeration, not your target concentration. So, that's it. Fumigation management plan is important to keep your people safe, but it's also a great tool. We were able to use it. That's a real life situation where we were able to use it to help with the re-registration.
And the instance I talked about earlier about the missing flask and being used under a house, that was down in Texas. And that company where that employee worked from, he just took a flask off the shelf, right? They had them on site, they stored them, they used them. Man, if you're using it and storing it at your facilities, you better have 100% documentation of every case you got in, how many cases you received, how many cases you used, where you used them at, and you better have that exact remaining amount in a locked storage container somewhere. Because if not, and any employee has access to it that's not a trained fumigator, you're going to be looking at some serious repercussions and major fines coming down the pipeline to you. Chuck?
Yeah, just had a comment that in Ontario, we have that separation issue.
Yep.
And we just can't fumigate bins.
Yep.
If they're close across a railroad track to residential, we have to move the grain to fumigate it.
Really?
To another bin.
Glad. America.
Yeah,
Great. All right. We're kind of winding down. Any other questions from the audience? I've got a couple more, but anybody got any questions? I hate to tie up all the time. So we've kind of talked a lot about uprights and concretes and pouring pellets and bins and stuff. What about like ground piles, bunkers, or, you know, center fills, or anybody having experience like kind of doing the big piles of grain sitting on the ground? Is there any difference with that versus an upright?
I've done a couple.
Yeah. I thought you might have in Kansas.
Yeah, I mean, you really got to watch your condition of that stuff. It's paramount there, but it's really getting the penetration and making sure you're getting that chemical to equilibrate underneath that tarp and making sure you got a good seal. It's a lot of preparation on the bunker itself of making sure you don't have weeds around the area, because we would have to come in and seal to the ground around the bunker walls. If there's any kind of gaps of weeds or grass growing around there, it's not going to get a good seal. You're not going to hold that concentration for the timely manner that you need for whatever chemical you're using at that time.
Gotcha. And how do you, I mean, so you're just cutting a bunch of holes in the tarp and pouring pellets all in and then trying to
No.
reseal everything and buying new tarps from JMI or whoever, whoever the other tarp manufacturers are?
We'd be using cylinderized phosphine
Yeah.
for it, which would be Vapor Phos, or you could use Eco 2, but that's going to be a lot of Eco 2.
Yep.
But cylinderized phosphine with Vapor Phos with our HCS units to be able to blend that out and introduce it into the aeration ducts underneath the grain pile that's holding that tarp down.
Yep.
So with that said, I mean, we have to keep the power off too. So you got to find a proper day to be able to do it to where you're not having wind blowing that tarp off, because that's costly and timely for everyone.
Gotcha. So, I mean, I'm sure there are ways to use pellets on bunkers and ground piles and get creative, but Pete's shaking his head no. But, you know, there's generators, there's different machines, there's HDS units, there's Vapor Phos, there's some new stuff coming down the pipeline really soon. Some other cylinderized fumigants, but there are new fumigants potentially coming into the market, but they're still phosphine, right? At the end of the day, it's still that same core compound and element that's killing the insects. I don't have any other questions. Does anybody else in the room have any questions? That was all the questions we had submitted beforehand. Got one on the far side, back room.
About the storage, you mentioned the DHS. How much can you store on site of aluminum and/or magnesium phosphide before you have to do the top screen, go through the chemical facility, anti-terrorist standards?
I don't know why everybody's staring at me. I don't work for Homeland Security. It's my understanding it's 500 pounds. Is that correct? Anything more than 500 pounds has to be reported to Homeland Security?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, it is considered a chemical of interest.
Yep.
I mean, if I was storing any, I would definitely document everything you have. Off the top of my head, I don't know what that number is.
Because their appendix says a placarded amount.
That would be a
No,
case.
more than a
Placard amount would be any
A
amount.
lot of it, they'll say it's this many pounds, but
Right.
with those two compounds, it says a placarded amount.
Yeah, it was my understanding that it was any amount was considered by the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah. I apologize for my ignorance on it. I believe the 500 pound, you have to report it, but the 500 pound threshold, then you get into like facility audits. It's a anti-terrorism security threat assessment protocol you have to go through. Yeah, at 500 pounds, you have to do all that with EPA. And Dr. Bartek may have some more info on that, but yeah. We have a giant regulatory team that handles that for us, so I don't know the exact one. I know that every one of our locations, we have to report and have Homeland Security audits. And it's crazy. Phosphine is a chemical of interest for bioterrorism, right? Somebody could steal fumigant and go do something bad with it, so we have to track it. Everybody knows how bad phosphine stinks and what the strong smell is on it. Perfume, which is an odorless, colorless gas, is not a chemical of interest. So it doesn't have to be reported to Homeland Security, but phosphine does for the time being. Yep.
So our head office is right, north of Indianapolis. So we just had the Indy 500 go on, and Homeland Security was kind enough to stop by our facility to make sure inventory counts were where they were supposed to be, and control measures. So it's 3 tiers of security for somebody to go through. They have to be non-redundant systems. So different locks, cameras, fence to get to it. An advantage for us is they were more so concerned about the vapor phos and the eco-fume, the cylinderized ready to use, versus the ALP, the aluminum phosphide and magnesium phosphide. It has been downgraded a little bit to our advantage. A bit, it is now a sabotage, where eco-fume and vapor phos are still at the chemicals of interest level, is the conversation that we just had.
On doing efficacy testing, so the high levels during the fumigant, is this poking the plastic over the fan and getting a reading there, or do I got to insert tubes somehow into the grain mass to get the good readings that I desire, and not just getting it off the very bottom or off the very top?
If it's feasible, center mass. If it's feasible, as close to the center as you can get it.
And that's what the tube?
So are you talking about drawing it out with the actual sample with a test tube?
Yeah, because if I just drop my
so-
cheat meter in, it clears pretty quick, when you pull it
Oh,
out.
you're talking about low range safety, like clearing
Nope,
readings, not efficacy.
High range.
Okay, so generally what we do is we would run polyethylene 1/4 inch tubing into that grain mass and then outside of the structure and take the readings from outside of the structure.
Yeah. So we would fumigate a lot of 20-foot diameter concrete bins, 125-foot tall. I'm just trying to figure out how I can do that. And we're doing it with pellets and trying to figure out how to get those readings.
Are you doing it in the grain stream, coring it down and
Yes.
timing it out? Yeah, I mean, you've got a stagnant grain mass there, or a static grain mass there, where you're just using the diffusion to go from high concentration, where those, like buttons on a shirt, pellets spread out. We up here don't always get that luxury of being called when you're filling, or when facilities are filling. So we utilize a J system, which recirculates the gas itself. So a lot of times, again, going back to the smartphone, it's nice to have YouTube or games or emails to get done. We'll go and start up the J blower, let it run for 20 minutes, a half hour, then go over with the pump, the tubes, and take the reading at that time. But we are altering what's going on in that grain mass, so it's also important to monitor for low range for safety, bystander safety.
Best case scenario, if you had a temp cable, I know we don't have that luxury in all concrete tanks, but a temp cable, go down about halfway, pull your temp cable up, and then tie it very well without something that can get into the grain. And put a filter on the end of it so it doesn't destroy your monitor. And then if you have that in each bin, then you can just walk by and sample each bin as it's under gas. That's your best reading. The top and the bottom, it's not your best reading. It gives you an idea of what's in the bin or if there is anything, but that core center of the bin is your best reading if at all possible. Yep. Jess? No? All right, I believe that's it for our panelists today. We get a round of applause for everyone on the stage.